use the word emergency for the first time in about...
This is Jim, and
Receiving this message. We are Ken Jennings and John Roderick. We speak to you from our present, which we can only assume is your distant past, the turbulent time that was the early 21st century.
Fearing the great cataclysm that will surely befall our civilization, we began this monumental reference of strange and obscure human knowledge. These recordings represent our attempt to compile and preserve wonders and esoterica that would otherwise be lost.
So whether you're listening from an advanced civilization or have just reinvented the technology to decrypt our transmissions, this is our legacy to you.
This is our time capsule. This is the Omnibus.
You have accessed entry 743.MT1325, certificate number 27832. Trofim Lysenko.
Что такое советская власть? В чем заключается сущность этой новой власти, которой не хотят или не могут понять еще в большинстве стран?
Are you gardener? I'm trying to think if your property, which has obviously some bushes,
It's got a little Seattle yard.
but it doesn't. Do you ever have you ever gone through a phase where you're like, I'm going to keep this plant alive?
Yeah, herb garden recently has been really my speed because a lot of those are perennials, which means you'll just have rosemary and mint forever.
Mm-hmm.
And it's useful.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like fresh herbs are great. And, you know, you'd have to, I come from a time when you could not get fresh mint or cilantro if you wanted it. And
You can make Moroccan whiskey.
Is that what you need for Moroccan whiskey?
Mm-hmm. Mint.
Mint, mostly.
Yeah.
It's the number one ingredient.
It's the only ingredient in Moroccan whiskey along with tea and sugar.
May contain mint. Does it taste like the back of a stamp?
It definitely tastes like the gum that 4 out of 5 dentists do not approve.
So I find that very satisfying. And I thought it was like, I gave my wife all these little herbs to plant in the box garden that was already in this house we bought. And she had no interest whatsoever. I mean, she liked using the herbs.
She's a great cook.
Yeah, she loved using the herbs. But like I was the one who was like, ooh, you know, I bet I should trim back the rosemary. It looks like the marjoram is not getting a lot of sun. You know, so I turned into Mr. Gardener. But it was because it was a very small square footage. It was one of those box gardens that seems manageable to the newbie.
You could look out and in a single glance know how your stuff was doing.
And you do get I did start to get I'm a good and valid person because my parsley is thriving. And then later I'm a failure because last year the basil grew and this year it didn't, you know?
Yeah.
Boy, what a roller coaster that is.
Oh, emotional up and down.
If the parsley's doing well, but the basil isn't, what does that even mean?
What does that mean?
About my place in the universe. That's a little different than it's the kind of landscaping you've been doing in your ravine is very satisfying because it looks different.
Yeah.
Do you feel like is it a kind of gardening? You don't get to eat the fruits of your labors.
No, it is. And I've never been a vegetable gardener interested in it at all because I feel like so many of the things of like early 21st century back to the land, backyard chicken coop. In none of those have I ever found that the produce is better than you can get at the supermarket, or cheaper, or more convenient.
Right. I would like to work harder for worse non-GMO zucchini.
Because my old house, which I called the farm, had a bunch of fruit trees, cherry trees, apple trees, pear trees. But with those fruits, they all come ripe at the same exact moment. You have to harvest them frantically before the birds get them.
The same moment.
Yeah, they're just like, a cherry tree is like, and not ripe. Now they're all ripe. An entire tree, 70 bushels of Rainier cherries all at once. And you're fighting the birds, you get them down, and then you have more cherries than you could possibly eat. And 2 weeks later, they're all rotten. And it's
And
just
all
like,
that diarrhea you got was for nothing because you didn't even
stomach cramps.
you didn't even make a dent.
And the pears and the apples, and it just feels like I can go to the store and get those things. And, and basically what I discovered in spending time in Europe is that most of the fruit, in Europe at least, gets turned into brandy. Right? Like
That's what stone fruit is for.
All the plums, all the cherries, it all is brandy.
Schnapps. It schnapps all the way down.
And so not drinking brandy, like 80% of what I would have used all those pears for.
Just make some applets and to a lesser degree cotlets.
I don't like applets and cotlets is the other problem.
I think you mean I don't like applets or cotlets.
I don't like, applets and cotlets, which is a single product.
TM. But are you totally immune from the sense that this cherry came from my own labors and therefore is more delicious than the Kroger cherry?
No, I like that to a degree, but I was an avid gardener at the farm. But I was an English gardener. Like I planted flowering bushes, trees, shrubberies.
That's an English gardener?
Shrubberies.
You don't have to actually be English.
An English garden is one of those where it's kind of like a riot of...
It's a regular garden, but I'm not in touch with my emotions.
No, it's the other way around.
Right, it's
You're
geometric form.
Super in touch with your emotions.
Wait, is it not the straight line thing? What is that called?
No, it's not mannered so much. It's more, it looks... English gardening is meant to look kind of natural.
It's like the fake wilderness.
Yeah, where but there's a lot of there's a lot behind it, right? You plant big leafed things in front and small leafed things in back to give depth. You put flowering this over waxy leafed that to create all this kind of dimension and color, and things bloom at different times. But all of that was, I was planting in a yard or a garden, so you have a fence in the back to give you a border, or you're making rooms in your yard, outdoor rooms. And
You're the Village Green Preservation Society.
It's exactly right. And it's very different from a Japanese or a French garden, I think. But now at the new house, I've been working in the ravine, which is trying to restore a native habitat, but I'm about to get shut out of my own ravine by the county restoration crew.
Oh, you've got the county coming in.
They're coming in. They're going to plant 1,000 new trees in my down in the ravine.
Wow, nanny state.
And now I'm excluded from messing around because they're like, we're taking over. It's a watershed. And although you own it.
Are you getting 1,000 free trees out of it? That's pretty cool.
Yeah, and all the labor. But they're like, for the next 3 years, you can't go down and monkey with anything. You have to leave it alone. And then after 3 years go by, we're going to leave. And then it's yours again. But you can't move anything.
Are you like fenced out, or you can go down there as long as you don't?
Oh yeah,
as long as you don't.
It's still,
garden.
And I've told them like, here are the trails, here are the places that I'm gonna be working. But they're like, okay, but we're going to restore this habitat now according to our principles, and your principles are taking a back seat until we've established it.
I would love that.
It's pretty great.
How come the city of Seattle won't come over and deadhead my roadies?
Well, I applied for this grant, and it was a couple of years that I've invested in it. But now I'm newly focusing on the part of the yard that is just yard, and I want to turn it into a sort of Chinese garden, a very mannered and structured and formal space.
Are you going to make a Zen garden? Are you going to have a rake?
I'm thinking, yes, but the problem is I've realized it's over my head. I've read 50 books and studied it, and it's an art that I can't
appropriate.
grasp. No, I mean, encompassing all the formal rules and understanding just spatially, just artistically.
And the stakes are much higher for you trying it as a white guy. Like if a Chinese guy tries to build a Chinese garden and
it looks like
part of it doesn't
garbage.
turn out great, he's like,
well, my dad was Italian, so I'm only half Chinese. So anyway, I called a landscape architect a couple of days ago that is an old friend of mine, a bass player that was in one of my early bands. And I was like, hey, will you come out and look at my yard? And what I'm looking for is a neo-Chinese garden, like a mid-century.
That's when you really trust a bassist.
Right? to come.
If you're going to have him re-landscape your...
So he's like, yes, I've studied this in college. Like, I'll come out. And so anyway, that's where I am with the garden. Pretty excited.
Well, it sounds like you're not going to get produce out of it. Chinese gardens don't usually have Chinese cabbage.
Even the cherry trees don't make cherries.
They make bok choy, confusingly.
No, they make beautiful leaves.
Blossoms.
Yeah, and blossoms. To pivot just slightly, in our lifetime, there's been a lot of back and forth, kind of political back and forth along the nature versus nurture question when it comes to human nature.
Or human nurture. As I call it.
And in the course of my lifetime, like I've lived through probably 5 or 6 different oscillations along the nature versus nurture corridor, kind of which one is the preferred version to back up some social engineering project, right?
Some view of what society should be.
Yeah, some new form of education that someone wants to introduce, a new set of essays that came out in the Atlantic. It's because nature versus nurture really undergirds a lot of our ideas.
Everything from criminal justice to, it's a real existential question. And the answer, by the way,
yes,
is nature.
We were
looking for what is nature.
I see. And so I feel like I
actually am a nature believer, mostly by virtue of being a parent.
And that happened to me too. I think I read all the articles for decades and was like, nature versus nurture. Well, I have this to say. And then I had a kid and watched her be her own person, completely resistant to...
What's crazy is to raise 2 kids.
Oh, right.
And assume you're doing everything more or less the same. I guess one is now in an ecosystem where there's a sibling.
Yeah.
But except for that...
They drink the same water.
It's everything the same, and yet... they could not be more different sometimes.
Your children are very different. and they both have...
And we didn't put one in a weird Skinner box, I promise.
They both exhibit characteristics that don't seem to resemble you or Mindy.
They come out of the faucet like that.
Yeah. It may not surprise you that nature versus nurture has been a political issue for many decades, a century at least in its current form. And then all the way back to Herodotus in terms of the question of how...
It gets into how accountable you are for your actions. Is it your fault? Is it your genes' fault? Is it your parents' fault? How do we address these things?
My dad always wanted our genes to take credit for all of my accomplishments, but my own agency to be responsible for all my failings. And
that sounds about right.
Yeah, he was pretty...
It's nature when my parenting worked out.
Well, he was ready to slide in there and say like, your success as a musician is down to our good singing genes. And I was like, no, I practiced the guitar. And he's like, yes, but because of your genes. I was like, no, I actually did this.
Hasn't my dad actually come up to you once and been like, well, of course, Ken gets all that from me.
Yeah. Oh, he has for sure.
I feel like he did it before that show at Town Hall. He was just telling people he didn't know that. And I felt like I had to come in and explain, that odd man saying these things to you is my father.
Ken Jennings Sr.
Which doesn't make it okay, but maybe provides some needed context.
Ken Jennings OG. We have a tendency, I think, the shorthand version of Western genetics and biology kind of starts with Darwin, who we assume was a kind of Copernicus who came into a world where everyone was completely ignorant of genetics.
He came into a creationist world
and dropped this science bomb on a world that believed that God made everything in 7 days. And kind of like Copernicus, Copernicus was not the first person to understand the motion of heavenly bodies.
Sure, heliocentrism, I actually don't know. Lots of ancient cultures.
Well, yeah, I'm
going to say Asia to be on the safe side.
Well, and the Arabs all had astronomy, like pretty sophisticated astronomy. Heliocentrism was some backsliding on the part of medieval Europe. But
geocentrism was the backsliding.
I'm sorry.
Heliocentrism was the good one.
That's right. Geocentrism was backsliding.
Ethnocentrism is also bad.
Yes.
but for different reasons.
But orthogenesis is the good one?
Is that after Peter Gabriel leaves?
Yeah, no, but before Phil Collins before he stops playing the drums.
Polyorthogenesis is a Mike Rutherford-based band.
The idea that traits were inheritable from the parents and that children were an admixture of their parents' qualities was understood back to ancient times. And there was a lot of...
You can see why anecdotally.
Yeah.
That
For
kid,
sure.
That's curly hair. That baby looks just like his sister did as a baby.
Even the ultimate creationist could not deny that a child was some combination of the two parents in a way that felt like, sure, God did this, but out of a toy box of parts.
And it's easy to see the mechanics of I actually don't know the answer to what was the last culture to figure out that sex made babies. But once you've made that leap...
I think that's still conventional wisdom.
I thought you were going to say that's still up in the air.
No, but you're saying the last culture to believe that sex made babies...
Sorry, the last culture to discover.
Oh, to discover.
I didn't want to say discover. I wanted to teach the controversy. Uh-huh. The last culture to decide, there we go, that sex made babies. 'Cause it's not automatic.
That this sex that you're having would then produce a baby. It does take a while for the baby to show up. By the time the baby is born, you've probably forgotten a lot of the specifics. But I imagine any time two tribes would collide in the world, and there was, girl stealing or rape as a component of it,
which was pretty common.
Which was, I think, universally common when tribes collided. Then the resulting pregnancy and the baby that shows traits that aren't commonplace
I see.
In your own tribe.
If there's what's the word for when you can see it? Phylogenetic differences between the tribes?
A different hair color or a different cant to the eye. I think that would the wise medicine.
That's not how they discovered it, surely.
No, but it would be further evidence, right?
True.
I think you would. Why does
maybe it's like this person who has never done that has also never had a kid, whereas these people who do have kids 100% have done that.
That's right.
That other thing we like.
So all the way back and throughout time and throughout the Enlightenment, and as science became more and more the lingua franca of the knowledgeable investigative set. The question of what it is in the parents that produces what we see in the child, how is that transmitted? It continued to be a fascinating topic, and there were tons and tons of theories about it, all
wrong.
Each
worse than the next.
Well predating Darwin, but what people didn't know was what genes were.
Yeah.
And so...
Including Darwin, right?
Including Darwin. And so the theory of...
He would have said dungarees.
He would have said khakis, because he was at the officer
Tweeds.
class. The idea that there was something in a parent that was transmitted to the gamete, it was understood that sperm and egg were the components that made a new child.
Right. And
how the information was transmitted through those small particles was the subject of inquiry.
Something in that cell knows how to make new cells, every part of the body, but how?
Right. And so the theory or I guess the doctrine of pangenesis, which was the idea that every part of the body produced little analogs of itself. So your hand would actually create little tiny bits of information, handedness that then went into your blood and then was
somehow got into your sperm or eggs?
Deposited in the sperm, so that a component of the sperm and egg had little elements of each part of your body that then, when the two collided, they kind of fought it out.
Who has the better hands?
Who has the better hand
shape
part,
Yeah.
the better hand. And it was called, Darwin called it the little parts were called gemmules. And the little gemmules, and this is the best that, the best minds of their time. And it predated Darwin by many years. The sense that the body recreated itself out of components in a world pre-knowledge of genes. The sort of pangenesis was a universally accepted or largely accepted in the scientific community idea of how human babies were made.
In hindsight, it seems like such a Rube Goldberg way for it to work. Like today we know that the sperm comes out of the box already knowing the blueprint. Before the hands even grew, sperm had the blueprint.
Right.
The idea that every part of your body would grow, and then at that point somehow tell your sperm how to make new ones. We now know to be an incredibly inefficient way to do that.
But when you see a child that has its father's nose and its mother's eyes, you're trying to make sense of that, and it just feels like, well, the eyes probably came down, and then the nose came down, and
something blocked the mouth, I guess.
And the kind of not knowing what the mechanism is, and believing in a kind of almost a magic of, and this was something pre an understanding of natural selection, a belief that components in nature had some agency, that they strove to be expressed. The nose, your nose and the mother's nose would go down, and each nose would want to be the nose that won.
And the idea that some things occurred were behavioral, right? Are we going to talk about Lamarck and that stuff?
Well, so Lamarck was a French theorist who who had a kind of a universal theory of nature and biology.
Well, la-di-da.
And one of his kind of, the thing that now he's most known for, but it's kind of a misrepresentation of, it wasn't a theory that he invented, nor was it a theory that he was especially invested in.
Oh, interesting.
He was just the kind of person that became the face of it during a later era when people were looking for a way to describe it.
So at the time, Lamarck wasn't a big Lamarckism guy.
No, Lamarck was not like the only guy that believed this, and he just had a larger theory and this notion that things that you learned in life or things that happened to you physically could be then transmitted to your progeny. Like if you lost a finger, sure, that the missing finger would not. That's a bad example, but like if you were a weightlifter, if you built up your body, that your children then would have strong bodies. If you were, your behavior could change your genetic information. Change your genetic information, and then that would become true of your line. And animals, so that, an animal that's trained to be mean could have a meaner offspring. Have meaner children and meaner children after that. And then it's a very different thing from Mendelian gene idea that if you breed mean dogs with mean dogs, you will end up getting a breed of mean dogs. That's very different from, I trained this dog to be mean and its grandchildren are mean. It'll have mean dogs, yeah. Right. And so what we call Lamarckism is kind of, it's unfortunate for Lamarck. He'll be fine. But this was, a kind of fashionable way of thinking at the time. And again, it's trying to understand how children express who their parents were. And I think it's natural to want to understand, as you see evidence of natural selection in the world pre an understanding of it or pre the theory of it, you want to feel like beings change, that as an animal confronts its circumstances and adapts to it, that those adaptations necessarily are then transmitted. And you want it for yourself, right? You want to think that you have some agency or that your decisions affect the way your offspring emerge. I think it's a big part of it, but also natural selection is so hard to grasp, and it's much easier to say a giraffe has a long neck because long ago a giraffe wanted to reach higher leaves.
So it
stretched its neck, and then its children had long necks, and they stretched their necks, and their children had long necks.
Because natural selection is just invisible and incomprehensible on the micro scale.
Right.
You really need to, hundreds of generations to even kind of imagine how that would work.
Well, and thinking of all the giraffes that died along the way, the giraffes that developed long...
Yeah, history's written by the winners, man.
Yeah.
Giraffe history is written by the winners.
And the fact that giraffes have long blue tongues and big, big eyelashes, the eyelashes aren't necessary to get the top leaves. Think of all the short eyelashed giraffes.
Yeah, Lamarck.
That didn't make it.
But natural selection explains that perfectly.
But
the long eyelashes make them sexier, so they have more
sexy.
giraffe calves.
God, they are sexy. But natural selection, and so we also have a tendency to think that Darwin, in proposing his theory of natural selection, also understood genes. And Darwin did not. He proposed natural selection, but actually believed in pangenesis.
Like at the micro scale, he had no idea what was happening, even if he was right about the macro.
Right. And he was not at all anti-Lamarck or anti the idea that changes in a parent could be transmitted to its offspring. And so after the Origin of the Species was published, there was, and this is all compressed in I'm sure there are plenty of futurelings who are biology PhDs who are rolling their giant eyelashes at us right now.
They're so annoyed.
I think
they're composing emails.
For most lay people, all of this timeline is very compressed. But in the second half of the 19th century, because Origin of the Species was published in around 1860, for the rest of the 19th century, although natural selection was generally accepted by the scientific community, the mechanisms of genetics were still hotly debated, and pangenesis was widely accepted as not incompatible with natural selection, right? The two went hand in hand and they worked perfectly well. What's crazy is that Mendel, this little monk who loved growing peas,
tending his peas.
He was like you, a guy with a little truck garden of peas, but he had
lots of free time, but for different reasons.
A lot of free time and a real scientific bent. Mendel grew like 5,000 peas and had this enormous sample, and was, because peas are pretty simple, and he was very good about keeping kind of the traits that he was breeding these peas for, kept them very discrete from one another, kept them very sort of clearly bipolar, I guess you would say. Like he wasn't trying to...
He kept good data of this or that.
He really did.
He started out as a guy that just wanted to eat peas.
He loved peas.
Man, I could go for some peas right now.
And then he was like, these are white peas, these are purple peas. I mean, the flowers. What's going on here?
What's up?
Why don't I keep growing these peas and cross-breeding them and see what happens? Mendel had his theory of genes.
What we now think of as genetics.
What we now think of genetics. And published it in about the same time as The Origin of the Species. But he was little known, and his theories were not widely disseminated. People didn't seize on his Mendelian discoveries, and his science was kind of lost.
Well, that's the problem with living in a monastery. Like, how's word going to get out?
Thank you.
He just tells some kids delivering stuff in the village, and he's like, hey, boy.
You there, boy.
You there,
what day
boy.
is it?
What day is it? Are you interested in the colors of my pea flowers? And you know what? If a monk asks you that, you take off.
You run for the hills. He did publish, though. Just like you and I were already in this bunker.
But wasn't it in like the monastery newsletter?
Yeah,
like
monastery
they put
newsletter.
pages in the elevator.
He went and hammered his theses on the door of his own monastery, and
We can't get out. Who
head
put this
monk
here?
was like, "Come on, do it on the outside of the door, not on the inside." So for the second half of the 19th century, all the best minds were still kind of trying to figure out genetics.
The mechanism.
And although accepting natural selection, still with pretty wild and in a lot of cases Lamarckian theories about how creatures actually reproduced and how natural selection actually worked on a micro scale, as you say. Like on a macro scale, it kind of makes less difference. But on a micro scale, it makes all the difference.
Right.
Why are there all these different beaks on these birds? Is it because the bird that succeeds passes his genes intentionally on to his children?
Do you think they had a? Do you think they had an idea of, if we understand the mechanism, then we can start to do Frankenstein stuff? Like, was it that early?
Well, yeah, and a lot of it goes along with other notions during the 19th century of education and social, a lot of the social change. Like now that we're educating a new generation of workers, they're going to produce smarter offspring. But also a lot of theory about the way the natural world works. I mean, and this continued into the mid 20th century. If you think about the Dust Bowl in the United States, a lot of that is a product of a kind of pseudoscience that believed that if you plant crops in what was formerly a grassland, those crops will, by their own kind of generation, will change the atmosphere of the Great Plains and make it into a place where the rain falls.
Well, they kind of changed the atmosphere of the Great Plains, but not in the right way.
Not in the way that they thought.
They made it more erosion prone.
Yeah, it was the working of the grassland. It wasn't the plants themselves. It was
They thought the plants would affect the weather.
They did.
I would have told them. I mean, it's easy to say now in hindsight, but if I'd been there, I would have been like, buddy, it's a grass.
But this was
It's not gonna
somewhat,
change the weather.
these were commonplace ideas that you could.
It was probably in the Farmer's Almanac. Chapter 1, the grass affects the weather, as we all know.
Because the idea was that plants wanted something. That things in nature have ambition and goal to have progeny and to be successful.
We know from the Omnibus that Stevie Wonder believed this as late as the 70s, when Plantasia was recorded.
Mm-hmm. It wasn't until Mendel was rediscovered, and he was only rediscovered in 1900.
There was probably like a Netflix series or something.
There were scientists at work who kind of independently started to arrive at this sense of like, now wait a minute, our own experiments kind of seem to indicate that that rather than gemmules, there really is an identifiable gene. And when they went and read in the libraries, they discovered Mendel. And this kind of happened independently. 3 different scientists, Hugo de Vries, Erich von Tischermark, and Karl Correns, all independently discovered Mendel around the same time and started to publish.
And Mendel sadly probably was already gone, right? Died in the 1880s.
Yeah, Mendel never lived to see him become the father of genetics.
But boy, did he get to eat some good peas.
Well, and he
died happy.
Of course, he doesn't have a lot of children being a monk. So there aren't all those, 20th century Mendels that were like living high on the pea hog.
Or we're trying to recapture all the fame once their dad's republishing all their dad's work.
Right.
There's no baby Mendels.
And Darwin also died in the 1880s. So he never lived to see his theories get synthesized with Mendelian genetics. This all happened in the early 20th century. And it was highly controversial there were a lot of other ideas still in play, and there hadn't been enough. Fortunately, Mendel was such a rigorous scientist that it was hard to argue with his conclusions.
He had math.
But he was also dealing with peas, and there were a lot of scientists that said, well, that might apply to peas, but when it comes to a complicated system, like a human being,
It's funny that they would still have the "we are special" illusion.
Oh, absolutely.
Even if the religion has faded out of it, they're still like, well, I feel more special than a pea, therefore.
I mean, there were still, a lot of this stuff was still kind of in play in our lifetimes. And it's hard to look back and remember that there were still papers being published in the 1970s that advanced the idea of how genes work. And we take it all so for granted now. Well, enter into this story
At long last.
the Russian Revolution. And, I basically look for topics that allow me to say the word Soviet, and here's another one.
You probably have said Soviet on the show more than I've said Soviet.
Yeah, that it's part of the omnibus canon. You should immediately stop ever trying to say Soviet again.
No, I don't do a lot of Russian themed shows, I think. Like maybe I do a show about the second in command aboard the Red October who likes to live in Wyoming or Montana. I would do a show about that guy.
I was a Russian lit minor in college, and that's why I think I always come back to.
I forgot you were a Russian lit minor.
Yeah.
Does that mean you understand Chekhov? Because I don't understand Chekhov.
Let me explain it to you offline.
Okay.
Well, you know what? You and I should do. We should just sit and read Chekhov together out loud.
I feel like I get Dostoevsky.
Yeah, sure.
But I don't get Chekhov.
Well, it's heady stuff. You actually have to do it with
Russian.
an independent theater company.
You have to be taking a troika to your dacha.
Yeah.
With a samovar in the blanket on your knees to understand Chekhov.
Well, what's interesting about all of this is it's all coming together and it's being promoted by various, scientists adopt these various syntheses. Synthesize. Syntheses.
Various synthesizers.
And start to kind of promote, the idea that this all, that there's a grand unification theory. But over in the Soviet Union, which is a country that right after the revolution and Lenin takes over, and one of the first things they try to do is collectivize the farms and create a new model for economics and for social structure. And the idea being that,
in their defense, the old model did kind of suck.
Well, sure.
Nobody wants to be a serf, even if you're free to serf.
Well, but the serfs got freed all the way back,
They did, but, was it really much better?
Well, I mean, you tell me. That's why we can't tax the rich.
They won't free the serfs.
But the new system was, because it was ideologically superior, there was a lot of pressure on it to also be practically superior.
Because otherwise, what was the revolution for?
This is the problem.
If crop yields go down, even under the beauty of Marxism-Leninisms.
Yeah. It's kind of a drag if you're...
That's why I attach none of my philosophies to crop yields. Like I have a lot of ideas, but in none of them do I promise twice as much millet.
Yeah, we see it all the time, right? Every ideology that produces some new social movement or some new government program, it's very tricky to find really conclusive evidence that it's produced the results you intended.
If I get the policy I like and social trends actually go the other way, I just say, well, think how much worse it would have been if you hadn't done my preferred policy.
Right, or that my
Hard
policy...
to prove that it wouldn't have been better.
My policy can't be held account because the other side thwarted it at every turn.
Exactly.
In the case of the Soviet Union, collectivizing the farms did not work. It really de-incentivized the former serfs, the agricultural workers of the new Soviet Union.
You got fat, lazy ex-serfs?
Well, they had no reason to put their all into collectivized farming because there wasn't any individual reward.
I mean, that is the thing about survival farming, is you really got to swing that scythe.
Yeah, whereas if you're working on behalf of the collective, there's a lot of opportunity to kind of shirk your responsibility.
Plus, it's probably just some dope from your village. The collector's going to be run by Sergey, and you always hated Sergey.
Well, yeah, and there are good farmers and bad, right? And treating everyone as equally good or bad isn't maybe it didn't produce, let's say, in the early years of the Soviet Union, great crop yields.
I'm starting to think this entry is not compatible with Marxism.
Well, that was very embarrassing and not compatible with Marxism. And so there was a lot of energy directed to, increased crop yields were like it was at the very foundation of the evidence of it would be evidence of the superiority of.
It also might collapse the regime, a hungry peasant class, right?
Right. I mean, there's every reason why you would want to grow healthy, robust crops. Well, during this period, there was also ideologically a real preference to promote people within the Soviet hierarchy from the proletariat. Right, the idea being that now there is a classless society, and so there's all this untapped knowledge and wisdom in that formerly was kept suppressed by this corrupt aristocracy, and now all these people that would have been described as peasants from rural villages are going to be promoted into positions of rank and power.
That's probably true in some fields, but I'm guessing genetic biology is not one of them.
Well, you might be surprised. Stalin came from a rural backwater.
And he was fantastic.
And look what a good job he did.
We all know his name now.
So, it's not just biology that maybe, like uneducated people from rural towns are not maybe the best ones to just thrust into positions of authority and power. And we're going to know here in the United States very quickly, maybe by 2024, when our government is run by
Madison Cawthorn.
Yeah, right.
I mean, in general, you would think, the solution would be education,
right.
And then the next generation of these newly empowered people are able to be capable. And
you mean the education would be transmitted to their children through their genetics?
Exactly. That's what I mean.
Well, enter into our story, the namesake of this episode, Trofim Lysenko.
Trofim.
Who was a illiterate rural farm boy.
Tired of this classism, John. Who cares if he's illiterate?
I guess couldn't read until he was 13, but then self-educated and
does he actually seem to be gifted? Is he a brightly shining star of rural Russia? He
was very interested in agriculture and I think initially did not have big ambition to become like a big wheel, but within his community, and he was born in eastern Ukraine, kind of the area that right now is under threat of Russian siege,
mm-hmm.
And was a child that came of age right around the revolution, and he was really interested in the science of the burgeoning science of agriculture. And
this is kind of new. We're going to turn the post-industrial revolution will turn the lens of science and the Enlightenment onto crops and not just the superstitions of the rural.
That's right.
People.
And Russia and early Soviet Union was a place where a lot of some of the best science was happening in genetics and agriculture, but also all of the science around biology. Russia was a leader. The labs in Russia, were some of the best in the world.
Look at Ivan Drago.
Exactly. Look at him.
It's fantastic what they did.
Super strong.
That guy was probably a weenie before.
Think about what his kids were like. Well, because he married Grace Jones. Think about what their kids would be like.
They have her eyelashes, for sure.
Very strong. So Lysenko started out trying to. There were famines as a result of the failure of collective farming, and there was also kind of like in all these famines a couple of bad years where it was very cold and there wasn't a lot of snow to insulate the winter wheat. And winter wheat is a kind of it reappears throughout history because it's kind of an interesting. Goes through an interesting process. Winter wheat gets planted in the fall, And then through the winter, the act of freezing the plant, the seed, is necessary for the seed to undergo its transformation to bloom early, and to produce wheat in the spring.
It doesn't bloom in the winter.
It doesn't bloom in the winter.
But it sits in the ground over the winter, and the insulating snow somehow is necessary for a productive germination in the early spring, which gets you an extra crop. Then you can plant the summer wheat.
That's right.
Twice as much wheat.
And winter wheat actually produces a different kind of wheat than spring wheat. It's actually a larger harvest, but the wheat is, is hard, little hard kernels that are better for making bread, and it produces a different kind of flour.
But it has some advantages.
It has a lot of advantages. And so Lysenko got interested in how you could artificially manipulate the seed by freezing it in a kind of laboratory setting and then plant it early in the spring rather than plant it in the winter, so it didn't have the threat of freezing out. And yet,
the idea, you still have to do the same amount of work, but you would just lose less crops.
You'd lose less crops, and also that spring wheat would be a better quality of wheat. You'd get that hard kernel. You'd get that wheat that was
independent of weather.
Yeah, that you would have you'd have
more control,
a bigger crop, right? And his work on this, which he called, and he was the one that coined the term that became the term of art in biology. He called this. He initially gave it a Russian name, but eventually gave it a Latin name, which is vernalization, which is still what you what you call this process of manipulating through cold and moisture the wheat
season cycle
seed to change to fool the seed.
You're making it sound like this might work if there's a word for it today. Okay,
it does.
So score one for Lysenko.
Score one for Lysenko. And Lysenko being from the proletariat and being a new Soviet man, he was very adept at taking kind of this new science and going out to the collective farms and kind of galvanizing the farmers to believe, no, this is real. We're going to use Soviet ingenuity to make a new kind of collective farm, and it's going to have bigger yields and better food. And he was very, very adept at kind of publicizing this kind of new take on collectivism and getting the farmers back excited about farming in the new Soviet style. And so he was a hero in Pravda. They wrote glowing articles about him, and Stalin loved him.
He's on stamps and on statues.
Well, not initially, but he really was the personification that they were always looking for of someone from the new school.
Peasantry who rose up.
Yeah, who was going to not just make the Soviet Union successful, but also was going to prove that the ideology was true. And unfortunately, Lysenko did not have a broad education and believed that this new kind of synthesis of Darwin and Mendel and the idea of genes transmitting without proletariat agency and without pangenesis, he believed that. Well, he didn't believe it.
He didn't believe in modern genetic theory.
He didn't believe in genes. He believed that this was a kind of capitalist decadent theory, and that
those capitalists eating so many peas that they come up with weird ideas.
Well, and it was against socialism because socialism.
It's counter-revolutionary to believe in genetics.
It was.
I don't understand.
And so he promoted an alternative theory, which was that the new Soviet grain aspired to be better and wanted to cooperate. He understood the competition of natural selection, but he also believed that that things in nature wanted to help one another because things wanted to grow and wanted to be better.
Right.
And so naturally, and one of the things he did was he encouraged farmers to plant seeds as close together as possible, because
so they can be full of collective spirit.
That's right, because he believed that the seeds would help each other because they wanted to.
I'm going to assume that doesn't work. That in fact it's bad when the plants grow too close together.
In fact, it is bad, and his theories did not long-term produce good crops.
He's like a Dunning-Kruger guy who's like, well, if I figured out vernalization, I can do anything.
Right. And unfortunately, by this point in time, he very quickly was promoted and promoted and promoted until he was the director of genetics for the Soviet Academy of Science. And it was, political appointments all the way because his theories were compatible with
Marxism.
With Marxism. There you go. And what they in fact did was produce more famine. And of course, the famines of the 1930s, the famines that produced what a lot of people in Ukraine call a genocide, were a product of a lot of different things, including, Stalin's sort of intentional desire to starve the people he didn't like.
Hence the genocide claim.
Right. But a lot of that famine and death can be, without too much trouble, tied to the policies of Lysenko, the agricultural ideas.
Because he's the ultimate Peter Principle guy who had been promoted far beyond his expertise.
But even in 1930s and 40s, in Europe and in America, the kind of synthesis of natural selection and Mendelian genetics and population genetics, that was all still ongoing in the scientific community. It was not settled, and studies it produced different results, and there were a lot of theories in play. In the West, it was increasingly understood that Lysenko was a fraud or a pseudoscientist, but of course those criticisms
right.
Were not received very well in the Soviet Union.
Well, they wouldn't have gotten to anyone.
Yeah,
right?
well, or I mean, if they in the global scientific community, that was just further evidence that corrupt capitalism wanted to thwart the Soviet Union, and incredibly, you can lose millions of people to famine and still believe in the ideology.
Well,
and that,
I mean, we've lost 800,000 Americans, and a lot of people still believe in that COVID doesn't exist.
So Lysenko remained in his position as director of genetics all the way through the death of Stalin, through Khrushchev.
Wow.
Through the 1960s.
At some point, do you think that even the higher-ups know that he's lousy as his job, but he's a powerful symbol, and he's got his own apparatus in place, and he's hard to...
So like a good Soviet, he also loved to purge his critics.
Oh, man.
So any scientists that came out against him lost their tenure and often got disappeared.
It really makes sense to purge your critics. I mean, speaking of natural selection.
Boy, I wish I could purge my critics.
It's just harder today. Your critics are more, one's critics are more distributed than ever.
That's right. I'm not in a...
I can't go to everyone's house and stop them from posting about me.
I don't just walk down a marble-floored hall with my click-clacky shoes on my way to your office to throw you into a van. And tragically, and we've talked about Lysenko briefly on Omnibus before, because Lysenko's techniques, his whole theory of genetics, was subsequently adopted by Chairman Mao.
That's where this came up before.
In the late 50s, after a time when when the synthesis of natural selection and Mendelian genetics was widely understood in the global scientific community and was increasingly, the evidence was added to all the time with new research and expanded. And we're still adding to the story now. As we said at the top of the episode, the question of nature and nurture is still in all the blogs, and it's still a very ideological question. Depending on where you fall and what you hope to achieve, you can write a very different position paper on the story. And as people have said, it's very hard to do research across millions of years,
Right.
but it's also very hard to do research with.
Yeah, you can't really do double-blind studies on children.
Right. What's the macro genetics of just the people that we know around here, right? As a parent, you see evidence, like irrefutable evidence that your child is not.
But that's for narrative purposes.
Right.
I'd be framing that very different if somebody came to me and said, well, here's how the criminal justice system should work with that in mind.
That's exactly right.
I would probably say, ooh, now I don't love that framing.
And kind of just like the last half of the 19th century, it's possible to hold conflicting views in your mind because ideologically you want one thing to be true, and then, experientially or scientifically you see another thing is true.
And quite probably it's, there is no answer. It's a complex mixture of both things depending on your terms.
Well, yeah, but that's what they would have said in 1790 too. And, increasingly,
and they were right.
increasingly, a lot of the things that they thought would never have an answer did, and they're just new things that we need to discern.
You just need a monk raising thousands of children.
Thank you.
And keeping some rigorous math.
And that's what we will eventually do.
Someday monasteries will be little matrix nurseries.
No, the futurelings are just our peas.
Sitting in a bed, kicking their purple and yellow limbs.
Unfortunately, Mao adopted Lysenkoism as a way of solving the collectivization of Chinese farms after the communist revolution there.
And he should have known better. He's had 20 years to see the results.
He should have known better, but you need a new system of agriculture that is consistent with Marxism. And if your agricultural system is inconsistent with Marxism, it's got to be the agricultural system that's wrong, because Marxism isn't.
Exactly.
Can't be. And so the resulting famines between 1959 and 1962 in China, which, opinions differ. I like to teach both sides of the controversy. Between 15 and 60 million people died of famine.
I mean, either way.
Even if it's just 15 million, it's still like
noteworthy.
It's kind of a drag.
I feel like that should come up on Mao's record.
And and it's on Lysenko's record because it's much more directly attributable in China to because Lysenkoism and collectivization happened simultaneously, or it was let's collectivize and then let's apply the new socialist acceptable theories of how plants grow. And Lysenko fell out of favor. When Khrushchev left office, there was a new, a reevaluation of, when Stalin died, there was a kind of liberalization, a Khrushchevization.
He gave that speech.
Yeah, but then after Khrushchev died in the mid-60s, there was a whole kind of reappraisal of the first 50 years of the Soviet experiment.
You could say some stuff you couldn't say while he was still alive.
And there was a lot of a lot of scientists that said, we're no longer being purged, and we would like it in the record that Lysenko was completely wrong, and here's the global consensus on how genes work. And so Lysenko fell, into a kind of somewhat disgraced condition. He lost his job, but his statues were still in all the, the science halls in all the universities. It's in some cases all the way through Gorbachev.
Because it would be embarrassing.
Yeah, he's the father of Soviet genetics.
And he did vernalize some stuff. Of all the people I can think of, he vernalized more things than anyone.
Anyone who vernalizes now has to has to tip their hat, has to put a nickel in the can
The old first fertilizer.
to pour one out for Lysenko.
And that concludes Trofim Lysenko, entry 743.MT1325, certificate number 27832, in the omnibus. Now, as we always say, social media is the plague and the genocide of our era.
Oof.
But
And, at the time, we thought maybe it had some scientific validity.
we thought it was compatible with Marxism.
But as we know from being in the future,
It was all bad.
irredeemable. Pseudoscience.
It led to the comet hitting somehow. But in our day, we were at Ken Jennings and at John Roderick on social media. You jointly could find the show at Omnibus Project. If you have electronic mail available to you in your era, maybe our mailbox is still not full, the omnibusproject at gmail.com. We received physical items at P.O. Box 55744, Shoreline, Washington, 98155. Hold on, I got some postcards. What do we have here? We have two confusing postcards from Churchill, Manitoba that made no sense to me until I realized...
Polar bears, and what's the other one?
Just the ugly aerial view of Churchill, Manitoba. It appears.
Listen, I'm pro Manitoba.
It's an aerial view of the town of Churchill, and it took me a second. Is this just some petroleum facility or... No, that's beautiful Churchill, Manitoba.
I'm pro Manitoba, but I should say, when they try to sell me a beanbag chair and then don't send it.
That wasn't Churchill, though. That was Winnipeg.
Churchill's going to have to bear some of the guilt, even though they're up in whatever, Hudson Bay.
You should do a cover of that I Hate Winnipeg song.
Who's that by? New Pornographers?
Some Canadian band, Weaker Thans, I think. You could do a new verse about their beanbag-related failures. The reason I didn't understand this postcard is because it actually has to be read like this.
Oh, weird.
Crossing the boundaries of the two cards.
You have to put them together. It's like a...
It's like a treasure map.
Nice.
This is what's going to tell me where the polar bears are. So thank you for sending us this puzzling set of postcards with some ideas for Churchill-centric omnibuses. Who is this even from?
Churchill is way up there.
A quote from the grapevine. I don't even see the name of the sender, but I would like to. I would like to credit him.
Are the senders really from Churchill? I love that. I mean, they're up on the border of Nunavut.
Oh no, he was on a rare train ride to Churchill, so it may be a Manitoban who is only headed to Churchill occasionally for work or for the festive holiday spirit there.
I feel like the train to Churchill is now a thing I need to take.
We also got a postcard from somewhere even more remote, from beautiful Chile, from Ramon, perhaps our only Chilean listener, who knows.
That can't be true. Everyone that listens to this show in Chile, please write immediately.
He is apparently more of a fan of you because he says that both sides of this postcard, the seaplane stamp and the thong-wearing Chilean girl on the obverse, are obviously
they
more...
both seem directed to me. Here, why don't you hand
more
that
your
over
speed.
here?
I'll never see that again.
Ken doesn't want to see thongs, and he doesn't care about airplanes.
I do not believe Chilean girls' buttocks are compatible with Marxism.
Oh, but he does put a lobster person on here, and you, Ken, are the real promoter of lobster people.
Well, he donates at the lobster person level. And you should too, by the way. Support our Patreon and become a lobster person like Ramon.
He's from Santiago. He's from the big city.
Jelena, apparently from...
Oh, this wait a minute. This postcard is from Valparaiso.
Sure.
Which I've been there, and I looked at the cover of this, and I was like, I know this seaport. The only thing that wasn't true of it was there were no thong girls. It's just
she appears to be possibly
superimposed.
Photoshopped in from possibly a better beach city than Valparaiso.
It feels very much like a industrial port in my experience, and not one with a ton of beaches.
I have never been, but I just saw the Pablo Larraín movie set there, whose name I can't remember. Ema, I think. And it did not look like a fun, it didn't look like a beautiful seaside getaway.
There are funiculars.
Oh, well, I've come around on Valparaiso.
Yeah.
There's a funicular in the movie. I just remember.
There you go.
Jelena from Quebec, I believe, sent us this postcard of the Soviet Pavilion from the 67 Expo.
Quebec, one of the remotest territories, remotest cities of Canada.
We do love a World's Fair. Well, it's Quebec, the province. That's Montreal, the city.
I watched the movie Arrival last night.
Had you never seen it?
No, I saw it and I liked it, so I thought I would watch it again, and I watched it with my 10-year-old, and she was like...
Well, she can't understand the ending. It's very...
Well...
Did she understand the twist ending?
We talked about it quite a bit. I think it was a food for thought thing. The first third of the movie, she was restless. Like, this is boring. There are no lightsabers in this movie at all.
You said this was a space movie.
And then right in the middle, there's like a section where the movie explains itself pretty clearly.
Mm-hmm.
And then she was very invested in it. And then at the end, I think my sister had a harder time understanding the time Ouroboros. I think my kid actually kind of grokked it. But watching the movie, you're like, is this filmed on Bainbridge Island? Is this filmed in the Northwest? It kind of suggests it is, but then you realize, no, it's filmed in Quebec.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. Looks like America.
I wish we would throw money at film production the way
There's so many Canadian right now
provinces do.
that are like, it is America. North America.
Got him. Sharon is a listener who apparently just discovered I like Star Trek. I don't know why that was such a stretch. I'm fine with Star Trek.
Which one? How do you feel about original Star Trek?
I feel like that's the one of my childhood, but I'm more of a next generation guy, and then it kind of ends for me.
How do you feel about original cast movies of the 80s?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
You're into those.
Yeah, like pretty much all Star Trek characters should spend all their time going back to the 80s and having comic hijinks in San Francisco.
How do you feel about the reboot where the young, handsome actors are playing the young versions of the old?
I guess I liked it until they started playing the Beastie Boys, and they all had like good Beastie Boys knowledge.
Because the
in
Beastie
the 23rd
Boys,
century.
Beastie Boys were like the Beethoven.
Yeah, it would really be like, how well you or I could, I guess you and I could just blast some Donizetti or Monteverde or something. Nobody could stop us.
No.
It didn't seem all that Star Trek to me.
Kill the wabbit.
But Sharon sent me a copy of the Star Trek font pack from 1992, which you would use to put all the Star Trek fonts on your computer. The yellow one from the old TV show, but also the one from the movie, the second and third movie first three movie credits. And there's a Klingon looking font. There's the font that like the signs on the bulkheads would say, like like where it's it says sick bay this way, or
these are cool.
Squeeze yourself into my Jeffries tube.
Do you have a way to put DVDs into your computer?
I still do. I went to considerable effort to buy a laptop that still had an optical drive. You make fun of my PC all the time, but how would you listen to a CD, John?
Wait, this isn't a listening CD. This is a typefaces CD.
Yeah, but you couldn't pop a disc of any kind.
No, I think, as an Apple cultist, Apple has convinced me that I don't want those things, Ken.
They're not compatible with Marxism.
No, you might want them, but
if you want them, but they're not in the computer, you must be wrong. It's exactly like Lysenkoism.
I don't want them because I don't want to be wrong. I don't want to go up against the ghost of Steve Jobs.
Thank you, Sharon. I love these TrueType Star Trek fonts already. Sharon notes that she had been a Patreon donor. Her business really took a pandemic hit, and it's not in her budget, but she still appreciates the show. And we thank all those who have continued to support the Patreon through tough times, and those who listen whose budgets don't afford it. We do the show for you as well because, as we've said, that's compatible with Marxism.
We're super mad at you, though, if you could afford to support
exactly.
the
Look in the
omnibus,
mirror right now.
And you're like, I'm getting it for free. Narc, narc.
And I think, did I do everything? The male and...
the female.
That seems solid.
And everything in between.
You can look for the Futurelings on Facebook and Discord and whatnot just by searching for the word Futurelings. Type it into Bing or Ask Jeeves.
Futurelings, from our vantage point in your distant past, we have no idea how long our civilization survived. We hope and pray that the catastrophe we fear may never come. But if the worst comes soon, this recording, like all our recordings, may have been our final word. But if Providence allows, we hope to be back with you soon for another entry in the omnibus.